So Valve was founded in 1996. We're a privately held company, and that's actually a consequence of other decisions that we've made that I'll touch on later. Why is Valve an interesting company? So if you use super gross metrics, it sounds like it could be interesting. We grow about 50% a year and have since we started the company. And we tend to make people very productive and they add a lot of value. So if you look at Apple or Google or Microsoft, we have much higher revenue and profitability per employee than they do. And we generate more internet traffic than most countries, right? I think we're the 4th largest bandwidth consumer in the world right now. So that says something is happening here, but is it interesting beyond just being another company that makes a bunch of money? This was the question I was trying to answer in 1996. Because we go out and we meet with all these companies. You meet with insurance companies and airline companies and startups in Silicon Valley. And you had to come up with some way of thinking about what the design was. And the thing that we became convinced of, Mike Harrington, who's the other founder, and myself, was that everybody was going in the wrong direction. There's sort of a movement towards outsourcing. And outsourcing is essentially, where can we find the lowest cost English language speakers somewhere in the world, and we'll give them a job and they'll do it just as well for a lot less money. To us, that seemed exactly the opposite of what you should be doing, and what we decided was that we were going to buy the most expensive talent that was out there in the world. That the opportunity was that those were the people who were least correctly valued. So at IBM in the 1980s, typical productivity would be 1,000 debugged shipped lines of code per year. Right? That was the metric that they used for sort of their median employee. Whereas when we were shipping Half-Life 1, one employee, Jan Bernier, was shipping 4,000 lines of code per day. So there's pretty clearly, it's easy to see that there's, even if you're not arguing about whose lines of code are more useful, and arguably Jan's lines of code were way more useful than somebody developing a 3270 terminal emulator for OS2. Even if you're just looking at the raw production, it's easy to see that there's huge variation in productivity. So when we designed Valve, we said, okay, that's what we're trying to do. Everything goes back to this fundamental question of how do you attract and retain the most highly productive people in the world? Because if our thesis is correct, that's where we're going to create our greatest incremental value, right? We could hire a whole bunch of. There was a big thing a couple of years ago where everybody was trying to hire low-cost content producers in India and China. And we were trying to do the opposite. We were saying, if somebody somewhere, somebody working on a feature film production in New Zealand is making $200,000 a year, if they come to Valve, they should be making $500,000 or $5 million, creating that much value. We'll split the difference and go from there. So there are consequences of those choices. One, Valve is not a publicly traded company. Being a publicly traded company adds a bunch of headaches, and it didn't really solve any problems for us, right? It meant that control around decision making now involved third parties. So for a developer or somebody building something at Valve, it's like there's the customer and they're the person that you're trying to make happy. And from the time that you make a change in a product, it's 15 minutes, worst case, before a customer is actually using that. There's no approval process. If you make a bad decision, it's 15 minutes until you've fixed that problem. You don't go to board meetings where the board argues about what the series, this third series of venture capitalists are worried about, dilution and hitting certain targets, right? There's no notion of a distribution channel who says we're really looking for something that fits in this particular slot at this particular time. The whole point of being a privately held company is to eliminate another source of noise in the signal between the consumers and producers of a good. One of the other things is that the kinds of people that we thought fit this model don't need titles, right? That titles are actually the enemy of their enemy rather than being something that makes them more productive. Oftentimes their solutions in one generation are different than their solutions in the previous generation. And that an explicit organization captured in titles makes it less likely for them to have the insights and to build the next generation of whatever it is that's going to be exciting, right? Whether it's the great example from Half-Life 1 is that the guy who designed the skeletal animation system also had a Bachelor of Fine Arts and could also build environmental art. So if you go to a movie nowadays, the idea that you would have a single person doing even much more than a subset of any of those roles is mind-boggling. But there are a set of experiences that you get in Half-Life 1 that are entirely a consequence of the person working on it being able to change the environment, change the code, or change the animations depending upon what was the most tractable way of solving the problem. So titles and organizations keep people from sort of properly encapsulating a problem at a point which allows them to be most productive. If that doesn't blow your mind, we have no QA department, right? We have no marketing department. We have one guy who calls himself a vice president of marketing because it confuses people if he doesn't tell them that when he's talking to them. But everybody at the company is we assume that their job is to talk to customers. We were willing to take what other companies would say were risks. So one of the first programmers at the company, his previous job was manager of a Waffle House. And he was one of the most creative, and still is, one of the most creative programmers in the industry. Well, our company evolves all the time. So I'll try to give you an example of how we evolve. I am a big believer in one person, one office. DeMarco's Peopleware, if anybody's read that, you know, I sort of treat that as a Bible. And so I was like, I hated cubicles, like with a passion and a vengeance. It's like, you know, they grew out of this data general philosophy of if you're screwing your employees, you're probably doing something right. And so I was like, okay, everybody always has their own office. And you know, and you've got a do not disturb button on your phone, and you have a door you can close, and you can decorate your office however you want. And people kept sneaking into other people's offices, and then they started tearing doors down. So everybody had their own office, but nobody was ever in it, right? So they were all congregating in our conference rooms, and so we had all these empty offices and all these clusters of people in conference rooms. And you know, that's when I realized, you know, they were making the right decision, right? They were deciding that there were benefits to being in closer proximity to other people, and that Gabe's rigid adherence to one person, one office was actually hurting their productivity. So even, you know, after being hit on the head long enough, I realized that everybody else was making a decision that was correct for them. And so now we just say everybody designs their own office space. So our largest single room right now has about 80 people in it. I share an office with 2 other people. But each person, you know, has to, that's one of the things that you think about. You think about how you communicate with other people. You think about what's an optimal work environment for the goals that you have. Desks are all on wheels. We only have 2 contact points with the floor, so you can pack up and join a different group of people in about 15 minutes. Some people are working on the design of, if anybody's done paired programming, there's some people who are trying to build a desk that's more optimal for paired programming and giving you a shared thing. And they have to make the decision whether it's more worth their time to work on something like that than it is to do the work that they already are. So we just sort of said, okay, each person has to make their own decisions about what they work on, who they're working with, what are the tools they need, and what, you know, what their offices ought to look like. But that's how we evolve, usually by people deciding that I have a bad idea. Another thing that became very important sort of later on, but it is pretty much part of the design of Valve now, is if you're not making quantitative predictions, you're probably doing it wrong, or you're probably not doing it as well as you can. And that's sort of become kind of critical to how we operate. You have to predict in advance. Everybody can explain anything after the fact, and it has to be quantitative or you're not being serious about how you're approaching the problem. Yes, in the green shirt?
So I'm at a flat company where we're actually experimenting with the valve model. What are some gaps or problems that you've encountered with the kind of flat hierarchy? Some lessons that have been learned that could maybe help us?
You have to be really aggressive about firing people. We haven't done a really good job with interns or new hires. It's kind of a sink or swim thing. You know, people have to take it seriously, right? It's an engineering problem, right? In the sense of you have to make decisions, you have to measure outcomes, you have to make changes as a result of it. So, I would have trouble working any other way now. I think most of the people at Valve would have trouble. There's something we call we sort of somewhat unkindly call the beaten wife syndrome, where people come in from other industries and really struggle. The worst are people from the feature film industry, where they've been sort of taught that anytime they show initiative, that somebody's going to leap out and smite them for doing that. And so that usually takes about 6 to 9 months for people to really sort of internalize the working model of the company. So those are some of the things we've encountered.